gentlemen.
Recording in progress.
It's sorry.
First thing on the video.
So welcome everyone to Snow Problem, how to hike safely in winter. We've been getting a little bit of a preview of winter these past couple of days, so I think it's very apropos at the beginning of the season to try to tell or educate people about how you can get out there and have fun even when there's snow on the ground. All right. Come on. Here we go. Just a couple of disclaimers. Again, this information is for educational and informational purposes. There's only a dozen substitute official medical advice. So if you have any questions, talk to a medical professional. If any of you are starting hiking in the winter or just any new exercise program, it's always good to check to make sure you're healthy enough to do that. So also check with your medical provider about that. And if I mention any specific websites or products or anything, I'm not paid by anybody. It's just my experience. If I got paid by them, I'd probably have a newer car. But yeah, just know that's just my own experience. And there is going to be a portion where we're talking about frostbite, where there's some images that some might think don't look too nice, but I'll let you know before that happens. So again, for those of you who have not been to these presentations, my name's David. I'm a physician assistant. I've been one for 15 years. Currently work at an urgent care up in Lincoln. And I have a big interest in wilderness medicine. I recently got my fellowship in wilderness medicine, and I do some volunteering for some groups around here, including White Mountain National Forest and Pemigewasset Search and Rescue. So love to be outdoors, and I love to teach people about the outdoors and how to be safe in the outdoors. So is there anyone who's never gone hiking in the winter or gone for a walk outside in the winter? I mean, we're New Englanders. We walk outside in the winter all the time. So some of this might be pretty rudimentary for those of us up here. But it's good just to kind of review how to stay safe. And we're going to touch on frostbite and hypothermia just to be able to watch for those as we're enjoying our time outside. So I think a big question is, why hike in winter?
No mosquitoes.
All the bugs are there. All the bugs are in hell where they belong. Although I did pull a tick off my dog today, so the ticks are still out there, but the flying, biting insects are dead. It's a glorious time of year for that. It's also not as crowded out there. I don't know if people remember this from 2 years ago. This was Artist Bluff. This is pretty extreme, but sometimes on the weekends, when the whites are even in like the Mount Major area, it can look like that, and it's not fun. Fighting against a river of people. The roots and rocks that sometimes are on our trails get filled in by the snow, and there's this beautiful like just ramps that you don't have to like watch your feet or anything in order to prevent yourself from twisting an ankle. And then it's just pretty. No leaves. You'd think that blues, grays, and whites don't look pretty, but we all know we live in New England. We know this is pretty. And it just is cool to be out there in the same area over and over again to see the changes through the seasons. So, what are the cons? It's cold. The temperature is sometimes unbearable. The ground's slippery, whether it be ice or snow. There's always a chance of us falling. And then we have a few cold-related injuries like hypothermia and frostbite that we have to worry about. That obviously we don't have to worry about if it's 75 and sunny. I like to think that the pros outweigh the cons. So when we're thinking about going for a hike or a walk outside, there are some special considerations that we should take into account. The first is body heat loss. This seems pretty obvious to us, but just, for those of us who have never seen a chart like this. So this is how our body loses heat. Conduction, this is where we lose heat by direct contact. Convection is air or wind blowing over us and cooling us off that way. Radiation is just the direct loss of heat from us to the environment. Evaporation is what happens when sweat evaporates off our bodies, takes out heat. And then respiration, this is a pretty small portion, but obviously when we breathe, you see the heat escaping our lungs. So this is something that obviously when we're outside in the cold weather, we're is walking to the mailbox or walking up a mountain, we always have to keep these in mind. Kind of dovetailing on that, in winter hiking, the control or mitigation of sweat production is like paramount, because again, you're going to lose a lot of heat if you're sweating, because the dry air is just going to suck all that sweat off, and it's going to cool you down really quick. So it is very important to mitigate your sweat production, and we do that for mainly doing layers. And we're going to talk about layers in a little bit. But you know, the donning and doffing of clothing is how we do that. So if we're hiking up a mountain, you know, typically we're going to be working harder. Our muscles are going to be contracting, we're going to make more heat, we're going to sweat. So a lot of people there's an adage called be bold, start cold. Some people will go in just a base layer on their top, you know, with normal pants. And as they move, they'll warm up. But everyone's a little bit different when it comes to sweating and exercise. So, you know, you'll have to figure this out like over a few walks outside. Like, how sweaty do you get when you first start? How sweaty do you get when you're going uphill? And then how much sweat do we do downhill? You know, certainly walking downhill is not as strenuous as uphill. So a lot of times, like me in particular, I sweat very easily. So I'm usually in my base layer going up. Maybe I'll throw something on at the top, and then I'll just be in like a fleece coming down. But again, that changes a lot with the wind, precipitation, things like that. So it's important to know how your body works, but also be prepared to either increase or decrease the amount of layers that you have. And obviously we have to take into account the environment. I don't know about you all, but any amount of breeze in the winter seems to drop the temperature by like 50 degrees. That is not what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says, but my feeling is different. But as you can see, you know, if it's 10 outside, you know, even with 5 or 10 miles an hour, you're already below zero. So again, layers come into effect there with what we call our shell layer, which is our windproof layer. So this is also something we have to keep track of. And then there's the elevation. Roughly every 1,000 feet you go up, the temperature drops about 3 degrees. So, you know, if you're going for a flat walk, it's not going to be a problem. But if you go up like Morgan and Percival, which are a couple mountains within 20 minutes of here, it's probably going to be about 4 or 5 degrees colder up there than down at the bottom, not accounting for wind and all that. So another thing to think of. Ground conditions, we've all run into this, you know, just walking around town or in our own driveway. You know, sometimes we have a really nice, well-packed trail. In the hiking community, we call this a monorail. Lots of people have walked on that. They've tamped it down, nice and smooth, pretty easy to follow. But sometimes you get, you know, 4, 6, 12 inches of snow on a trail. And all of a sudden you're having to plow through this thing like Einstein the Corgi is here. So that kind of changes what you might bring or what you might expect on a trail. Or sometimes it's icy, especially in the shoulders. You know, right around now, I wouldn't be surprised if there's ice on the trails. Springtime, obviously, but we've also had some warming temperatures. We had those bad ice storms a couple of years ago in December, so always something to keep an eye, keep track of and think about when you're getting out there. Sun exposure. This is something that we obviously think a lot about in the summertime, but the sun doesn't go away in the wintertime. It's that bright shining ball in the sky. And the exposure to the UV rays is the exact same as it is in the summer. We don't think about it as much because we're more covered up, but the snow actually reflects about 80% of the UV rays that the sun beams to our planet. And every 3,000 feet you go up, the UV ray percentage goes up by 10%. So it's important to think about this, that we should honestly be putting sunscreen on before going out for hikes. Goggles if you're a skier, shades to protect your eyes. These are some of the things people don't tend to think about in the wintertime, because we typically stay inside a lot. But if you want to be outside more, this is definitely something that you'll notice. I've definitely come back, after snowfall and looked in the mirror and my face is red from a mild sunburn. And then there's avalanches. You're not really going to run into this unless you're really going to the high places of New Hampshire. Particularly Mount Washington. There was one avalanche in Franconia Notch. So these take some pretty specific conditions. It's got to be a 30 to 45 degree slope, different snowfalls. So I wanted to mention it because it technically is something we have to think about in the winter. But the vast majority of us are not going to be going to avalanche country. I myself don't typically go. But there's some websites that you can go to find out your avalanche risk factors in Mount Washington area. All right. Next, onto what to bring. If any of you were here for my first talk, we talked about the 10 essentials, but if you weren't here for that, here's a brief review. So it says 10, but this is 11 items because my asterisk is a shared plan. Always tell people where you're going and when you expect to be back. That's how the vast majority of people die, is people don't know where they are. A paper map or compass, warm clothing. Obviously, this is very important for us for this presentation. Extra food and water, flashlight or some way to see. This does not count. There are many, many search and rescue stories about people who call for help because their phone light is running out. And search and rescue doesn't always care. Fire starters, in case you need to make a heat source, first aid kit, whistle to alert people when you are lost. Rain gear, this includes our waterproof wind gear that we'll talk about, and a knife. So when we're talking about layering, the first thing I like to talk about is like what layers are made of, what type of material. So in the hiking community, wool is king. So either sheep, alpaca is becoming more popular. There's synthetics like polyester as well. And then there's cotton. Anyone know about what there's a saying about cotton?
Cotton kills.
Cotton kills. So the question is, does cotton kill? It depends. So it doesn't actually kill you, but the reason they say cotton kills is cotton holds on to a lot of sweat, but when it actually absorbs the water, cotton loses its insulating factors. Wool does not do that. If wool gets wet, it actually still can insulate. So that's where we say cotton kills. Now, if you are a person who doesn't sweat that much and you're going for a 1 mile walk in the woods, you could probably get away with a cotton t-shirt and be just fine. Or on those unusually warm days in January or February where it gets the 40s, yeah, cotton probably wouldn't be a bad idea. But I would probably have something in your backpack to change into if things change. All right. But definitely no cotton socks. Or jeans. All right. So does anyone in here ski? Okay. So this might be familiar to you folks. So there's 3 different layers that we talk about when we're talking about layering. So the first is our base layer. This is the one that's right next to our body. This is the one that we want to actually wick away any sweat that we're producing. And typically you're going to want this in wool. Synthetic would be okay. And I do have some examples on this table if you want to come up afterwards and look at it. But I mean, they kind of look like long johns, but obviously long johns are typically cotton. And they're typically not very bulky, they're just thin. So that's your first layer. And again, if you're a heavy sweater like I am, I might start with some, not base layer pants, but some fleece pants and this just to start my hike. Then we get to our insulating layer. This is things like our down coats, our fleece jackets. This layer is supposed to give you some dead space where air is not moving as much, so it actually traps warm air and actually warms your body. All right. And then finally, we have our shell layer. Our shell layer is waterproof and windproof. And what that does is when you go outside and it's windy and wearing a fleece, you'll probably notice that the wind goes right through it. So this isn't really great for insulating from the wind, but if you put this under one of these, you'll be very, very warm. Because the shell layer is protecting you from the wind blowing out all that air that you're trapping in those fleece fibers or down fibers. All right. Any questions on layers? Nope. Okay. So then we get to some of the more obvious things, the head, the face, the eyes. So again, this is going to depend on, are you just going for a walk in the woods? Are you going to be above tree line? You know, you might get away with just a regular beanie just to cover the ears. There used to be this thing, my scoutmaster used to tell me that 90% of your body heat goes through your head. That is not true. These are more important for protecting the very sensitive areas of your head, such as your ears. This is called a balaclava or a ski mask. This obviously will protect your cheeks and your nose and your lips. You know, and then we have your bomber hats. That's the bomber hat I wear. I love my bomber hat. Keeps my ears nice and warm. We have buffs. These are just tubes of fabric that can protect your neck. So again, you're gonna have to find like what works for you, what's comfortable for you. Obviously, putting these things on can also increase sweat. So another thing we have to keep in mind. And then obviously we have our different eye protection. So some people just get away with sunglasses. If you're going above tree line or it's particularly bright, if you have access to ski goggles, those are actually very helpful because they actually block all the way around your eyes. Feet and fingers, obviously, we have our wool socks. And you can buy these are called sock liners. These are typically silk. This is just like a base layer for your feet. So again, these will soak up some moisture, keep them away from your feet, and just keeps them warm. If anyone has really cold feet, I would consider looking into some of these to put underneath your wool socks. They are a game changer. Same thing with gloves. You can get some thin gloves, and you can get some big, thick gloves and layer those as well. And again, take them off, put them on, depending on how you're feeling as you're hiking. As you can see, like I'm mentioning all these things, when you're going out, sometimes you're going to need a bigger bag than when you are hiking in the day, in the summer, sorry. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. And if you're looking into going out in the winter on a regular basis, you may have to look at Walmart or Amazon or REI and get, instead of maybe a 30 or 35 liter pack like you would normally be able to get away with in the summertime, you might need something like a 50 liter. Like this is the pack I use in the winter time. Yes. This is not the pack I use in the summer, but you know, so this is like a 30 liter pack, just a regular school backpack. See how much bigger this one is. So you're carrying a little bit more on your back. Next we got traction. So again, the same three photos we were talking about ground conditions. So if we're walking and we find that we're in a nice, well-trodden trail, sometimes we can get away with just a bare boot, with the understanding that snow is slippery. So if the conditions are slippery, such as if it's icy, sometimes we need a little bit of extra traction. These are called micro spikes. They are probably the best $50 to $70 you'll ever spend. I use these walking to my mailbox sometimes after those ice storms. My wife uses them even though she doesn't hike, so these are very useful to have, and they just slip over your boot. I have one over here. I mean, they just stretch right over your boot. You know, I put these on my slippers, again, walking out to mailbox, so not anything that you need, you know, a lot of tools to put on. And then if you have some fresh snow that you're trying to get through, you might need to upgrade to some snow, to some snowshoes. These are MSR snowshoes. These can be a little expensive, but you can go to Walmart. You can go to, I think Ocean State Job Lot typically has some like cheaper versions of snowshoes. You know, I wouldn't take them up Mount Everest or anything, but you know, if you're just doing some hiking around here, they'll get the job done. You just need something that has a wide base that's going to keep you from sinking in the snow and a little bit of traction. And then there's the miscellaneous stuff. So hand warmers, I know people bring these. This is really just to warm your hands. You know, this isn't going to like reheat you back to a normal body temperature if you're hypothermic or anything. But if you're someone who's feet get cold or hands get cold, this is really nice. Emergency blankets. This is my third presentation. I've talked about emergency blankets in every one, and I'm going to talk about it every presentation. They're cheap, they're light, they can save you in a pinch. And then, you know, hot drinks. There's nothing like getting to the end of your hike or the top and having a nice mug of coffee or hot chocolate. It is fantastic. But and a good pick me up. So we talked about what to consider, we talked about what to bring, but how do you get out there? You know, because it's, you know, I'm making it seem like it's difficult, which it's not. It just takes a little bit more thinking. So I always recommend if you've never really hiked outside, start on a flat trail or even on your own road. Chamberlain Reynolds right down the road is a fantastic series of trails. It goes right along the Squam Lake. It's pretty well trodden, so you're not usually trudging through like 24 inches of snow that no one's walked through. The Lincoln Woods Trail up in Lincoln is an old railroad track, so it's flat. Again, very popular, very well trodden. And then Page Farm Community Forest in Meredith, it's on the road that goes to Moulton Farms. It's just down at the end. And again, some nice trails in there. Before you get out there, after you get all your layers and your hot chocolate and stuff, watching the weather. We all know living in New England that the weather can turn on a dime. Even the morning of, you know, we've all had that wake up where we look outside and it's snowing and they were calling for snow the next day. So definitely keep an eye on that. And after you go on your hike, kind of sit down for a few minutes and just say, all right, what worked well? You know, were my layers good? Did I keep layers on too long and I was sweating, or did I get too chilly while I was walking? Should I have changed that? This is a really good time when you're inside, out of the elements, kind of reflect and change for the next time. Then once you get comfortable with that, you know, maybe go on a short hike with some elevation. Rattlesnake and Rumney is about as easy as you can get. You know, I don't think I've ever seen it not packed down throughout the whole year. And Whitten Woods and Ashland is also pretty nice too. That's a lot of people go cross country skiing in there, and you get some elevation. You get to find out what your body does when you're actually going uphill. And then obviously just longer hikes as you become more comfortable. Before we get on the frostbite, does anybody have any questions about layers, prepping, anything like that?
I had something that came to mind when you were talking about hot beverages. If you drink coffee or with caffeine, I remember hearing it's because it is it a diuretic or something that it can make your extremities cold because it constricts your blood vessels or something? Is that true?
Yeah, caffeine's not powerful of a blood vessel constrictor. Technically, yes, but it's not enough to make a difference, honestly, in my experience. All right. Speaking of blood vessels constricting, frostbite. So what is frostbite? Very simply, it's a cold injury to your cells from freezing. All right. And freezing is the most important thing here, because if it's 50, you can't get frostbite. All right. That's different injuries to your injuries. But yes, comes from a freezing injury. And how does it happen? This is kind of a busy chart, but basically things get cold, the water in your cell freezes, and cells die. But at the same time, your blood can thicken, which causes blood clots, decreases oxygen, cells dying, and blood vessels constricting, decreased oxygen, dying. So it's all about cells dying in numerous different and fun ways. And this is not like a flash frozen kind of thing. This is a continuum. It slowly gets worse as time goes on. So the sooner that you identify what's going on, the better off you're going to be. So these are the photos if people don't want to see what bad frostbite looks like. So we kind of put them in degrees like burns. So first degree is obviously the least worrisome. What you're going to start seeing is numbness with some white or yellow hard areas, almost like it's frozen, like like frostburn from something on your freezer. I pulled this off of some guy's blog who decided to run outside for 10 miles in wintertime barefoot because he's a barefoot runner. I don't know, to each their own. Yeah. And then this was a couple days later. So once he recovered, he kept his toes, but sometimes the skin starts peeling off. So if it kept on going, the more damage that happens, then we can start getting blisters. This is from the cells getting leaky and releasing that fluid into the tissue surrounding it. And then if it gets deeper, it starts affecting the blood vessels and they get bloody. And then if it goes even deeper and things die, then we get to what we typically think about frostbite. These are your like Mount Everest survivors who lose some toes and fingers. I think this was a homeless gentleman in one of the major cities in the US. So again, it's kind of a continuum. But what we want to do is catch it here because this has a very little to no chance of actually causing any permanent damage. Once you start getting to these, obviously these start causing issues. So if you notice that you have frostbite or a partner that has frostbite, 2 hours is what I want you to think about, all right? Are you less than 2 hours or more than 2 hours from a protected environment or your home, hospital, whatever? And the reason is because that determines whether we're going to try to reheat these areas or not, okay? And I'll get to why 2 hours is important in the next slide. So if you're less than 2 hours, if there are any blisters, like we saw before, we want to wrap them with clean, either gauze from our first aid kit or a dry t-shirt, something just to protect that area because we don't want those blisters to really pop if we can help it. Because that actually can increase inflammation, actually worsen damage. So if we have wet socks or wet gloves, we're going to want to take those off. We're going to try to dry those off and cover them if possible with dry socks or gloves. For our hands, under the armpit or down our pants is the warmest areas. If it's a partner's foot, you can put that under your own armpit until they start getting feeling back. And then you need to get out of the woods. And the reason is because if you rewarm it and it freezes again, you can actually cause increased damage. What we're not going to do is use a fire or a hand warmer, because those are very concentrated sources of heat. And what frostbite needs is like a circulating constant source of like gentle heat. So if you make a fire and you put someone's foot next to it who's already numb from frostbite, you can give them a burn on top of frostbite, which I don't even want to think about what that feels like when it heals, when the feeling comes back. So, and then the other thing is they used to recommend rubbing frostbite with snow for some reason. The reason we don't want to do this is when a cell is frozen, a cell is nothing more than a bag of water. And when water freezes, it makes ice crystals, almost like snowflakes, but at a microscopic level, those are very sharp and they actually poke through cell walls. So if you think of a bag that now has glass in it and you rub it, you're going to make more holes. So you're actually going to increase the damage. So do not rub. Now, I just saw you do this. If your hands are just cold and not frostbitten, you can do that. But if you're showing signs of frostbite, no like vigorous rubbing. You can, just the gentle, like trying to warm it like this is fine. But there's some people who just like would like go to town with the friction heat. You do not want to do that. So I kind of mentioned it already, so. If we warm up a frostbitten area and it freezes again. That causes more damage, so if you're more than 2 hours from home, hospital. Don't rewarm it, wrap it up. If you can get help to come to you, that's better, because you don't want to use these extremities, especially the feet, unless you have to. But if it's a life or death situation, you can walk on those feet. All right. It's not going to feel very great, but at least you'll live. And then again, call or go for help. That's really important. There's more treatment of frostbite, but again, this is just a first aid presentation. There's all sorts of things you like I can do in the urgent care, they can do in the hospital, but this is kind of your nitty gritty. You see frostbite, these are the first steps you do. Yes, sir.
What about like warm water?
So that's the next step. So so this is more for like out on the trail. Yes, so that's the next step. If you have mild frostbite or even the more severe frostbite, to rewarm it, the best thing to do is put it in a warm water bath of about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is typically a hot tub temperature, and keep it there for like an hour. You can do that with, there's like fancy circulators you can use. If anyone's familiar with a sous vide machine, cooker, you can do those. That's what we have at our urgent care. So yes, that's the next step. But if you were to develop any of this for purposes of this presentation, I would just go to the hospital at that point to get checked out, because they can determine how bad the frostbite is, what to do from there. All right. Lastly, let's talk about hypothermia. So, hypothermia, just the generic medical definition, is your body temperature is below 95 degrees. All right. But obviously, so has anyone ever like been hypothermic that they know of or been treated for? Of course you have. Yeah. So hypothermia is not fun. I got mildly hypothermic once, and like I couldn't stop shaking for 2 hours. It's not a fun experience. But I don't know what my temperature was, but it was below 95. Unfortunately, Jack here was out a little bit longer. So again, we talked about this, how the body loses heat. Again, for purposes of winter hiking, convection and evaporation loss is most important. Respiration, radiation, conduction, less so. So what does hypothermia look like? So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on 3 things if we suspect somebody has hypothermia. Are they awake? Are they confused? And are they shivering? All right. There's a lot of stuff that goes on to a body as it progressively goes down through temperature, but those 3 things are the most important to look at. So, mild hypothermia. Typically, these people are awake, so we are right now. They're not confused, and confusion can be a lot of different things. Confusion can be not recognizing people. It can be, there's this thing called paradoxical undressing. Sometimes when you read stories about people who unfortunately have succumbed, sometimes they'll mention that they were not wearing warm clothes. It's an interesting thing that happens, that when our body is trying to shunt warm blood back to our core, because this is more important than these, the blood vessels are using muscles to constrict. But after a while, you run out of energy and those muscles release. And so the blood rushes back to the face, the extremities, and people feel very flushed. When it's combined with confusion, because the brain doesn't work very well when it's cold, they think I'm hot, so I have to take off clothes. So that's why you'll see sometimes in descriptions, people will be, typically they're not naked, but they are like in t-shirts and shorts and like no shoes and stuff. So yeah, confusion can be that. Confusion can be disorientation. So it might be subtle, but usually you can kind of tell they're not acting right. But if you're mildly hypothermic, you're shivering. And the thing about shivering is, again, it's uncomfortable. Most people have had shivering in their lives, but shivering is the most effective way to reheat a body. You know, we think about like blankets and warm and getting a hot tub or something, or but shivering is actually the most effective way to warm a body that is cold. Because that is how our body is evolved. That's how our body knows to make us warm. So that's my hypothermia. Moderate, these people are still awake. They are starting to get confused. And depending if they're kind of near the higher end of moderate or lower end of moderate, they might still be shivering, or they might not be shivering. And what this means is their muscles have run out of energy to contract. All right. Just like people running a marathon might hit a wall and collapse. That can happen with shivering. And then if they're severe, they're unconscious. They aren't talking to you and they are not shivering. These people are on their way out. But again, it's not you don't go from great to this. This is a slow descent into danger. So we're hiking with a friend. We're like, oh, Adam's shivering really bad. He's taking off his boots.
I'm sweating.
He's sweating. What do we do? Or maybe he fell in a river. All right. So this is Adam. He's wet. You need to get him out of his wet clothes. You don't have to cut them off like this is, but try to reason with Adam. Say, Adam, man, you're kind of wet. Let's get some dry clothes on you. Always use their stuff before you. Just because you gotta be well enough to help them as well. If they're shivering, support it. Again, shivering uses up energy. So give them energy, give them calories. That's what these people need. Obviously, if they're unconscious or going in and out of consciousness, do not feed them. But if they are awake and able to follow directions and stuff, feel free to give them food or drink. Also, our friend the space blanket's back. Space blankets are really nice because they make a vapor barrier. What that is, it's similar to our shells here. It prevents heat from moisture from escaping, increases the humidity. Humid air holds on to heat longer, which we're finding out more and more every year. So that can sometimes help with somebody in mild hypothermia. So the previous slide and this might all mildly hypothermic patient needs. But if they're in moderate or severe, sometimes they need a burrito. Not this burrito, a human burrito. This is called a hypo wrap. We're going to be doing that in just a few minutes. So what a hypo wrap is numerous layers like a burrito. So we have something on the bottom. I like to call this the plate because we don't want to put our food on the ground. This can be something, I brought a sleeping pad, but this can be sticks. This can be backpacks underneath. If all you can get is the core off the ground, that's fine. Then the next layer on the outside, this is our tortilla wrap. This is, if you're, in search and rescue, we have tarps, but again, this is going to be an emergency blanket. Then we have our rice. Rice is fluffy, traps a lot of air. This is going to be an insulating layer. This can be a fleece blanket. This can be extra puffies or fleeces. Again, using their stuff and your stuff or others in a group, if you're in a group. And then there's another vapor barrier on the inside, which I call the cheese. So plate, tortilla, rice, and cheese. I like my burritos very, very plain. And then you have your meat, the person. Okay? So that's how you do a hypo wrap or a human burrito. So, like I said, we're going to do those in a couple minutes. So, do you stay out in the woods or do you try to get out? If it's mild, and let's say Adam was only shivering and we gave him some hot chocolate, give him his emergency blanket, and he's like, pops right back, stops shivering, he feels great. Okay. It's okay to keep on going if you want, but if I were him, I'd probably just want to go home at that point. If he's wet, probably has to dry stuff off, probably has to reevaluate what he brought with him, what mistakes were made along the way. If we're moderate or severe, and we have to put somebody in a burrito, don't move them. And the reason is, as the human body gets colder, one thing that really gets affected is the heart. And the colder you get, the more sensitive the heart is to going into irregular or even deadly rhythms. So if you think someone is really hypothermic, either unconscious or moderately hypothermic, put them in the wrap and don't move them. And go and call for help. Because that person probably needs to be carried out of the woods to prevent them from potentially dying at that point. All right. Let's make a burrito. Before we do that, does anyone have any questions?
So it might be outside of the scope of this talk, but if somebody, so you pulled somebody out of freezing water or something,
Mhm.
what do you do?
Take their, get them out of the wet clothes as quickly as possible and get them into dry clothes as quickly as possible. Even if it's cold outside,
Mhm.
you know, if it's like 15 degrees and it's blowing 20 miles an hour and somebody fell into a river, at that point, the cold soaked clothes are going to kill them quicker than the wind is. Yeah. Because at that point, you're just you're fighting a losing battle. Even if you have like high grade like Gore-Tex and wool and all that stuff, if you fall in and it's soaked, you gotta get them out of those clothes. Yeah, cool. And if they're not dry, if they don't have any dry clothes, hopefully you have dry clothes of your own and an emergency blanket, and you can try to keep them warm as you can.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Let's make a burrito. Is anyone feeling particularly cold right now?
I'm feeling